Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Davide Ceper is CEO of Varda, a new agricultural tech startup whose mission is to enable the use of field-level data to accelerate the transition to a nature-positive food system. The Varda mission is to make farm and field data the key ingredient to feed the next green revolution. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Davide, good morning. Welcome to the Astrology Podcast. Great to have you as our guest. How are you this morning? How's life in Milan? Is that where I would find you?
Yes, that's exactly where I am. It's great, Lee, and thank you for having me. It's a lovely day. I mean, it's been lovely yesterday. Now some rain has come, but we're great. Fantastic. We actually needed some rain. It was a very dry winter, so everybody was concerned about agriculture. No, there's been a bit too much of it. We had big floods in Emilia Romagna. You may have seen in the news, but here in Milan, everything is great. Okay.
Well, I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into our conversation this morning, and to your point around the environment and agriculture. I'd really like to start there with Varda, because it's a proposition that fascinates me, but that certainly from my own perspective, and I can't speak for listeners, it's unfamiliar ground, it's unfamiliar territory. So if I may, let's start with Varda. What's the story behind Varda AG?
Thank you for asking. So Varda is a corporate spin-out, is an ag tech company, as we say in the industry. So it's a digital agriculture startup. It was created as an initiative by Yara, which is one of the largest fertilizer companies in the world. And the intuition was very simple. The problem that we wanted to solve is there is too much fragmentation in data in agriculture, and you have long-term trends that are appearing and strong demand from consumers and regulators to get a better understanding of what is happening on the fields of every farm, ideally. Because we've been following a model of production that assumed infinite resources, and this is a problem in every industry, I would say, but agriculture is one that consumes a lot of very, very critical non-renewable resources, if you want, which is the land, the natural capital. But depending on how we do that, we may end up generating long-term unintended negative consequences in the industry, the food industry in particular, that depends on agriculture, but there are also other critical supply chains like fiber production, think about cotton, natural fibers, and fuel. Biofuels is a component of the way we produce energy. All of them insist on the same thing, which is the land. And land has become more and more scarce in the last few decades. The methods of production and consumption that we've applied have caused, as I think everybody's quite aware that reads the news, massive impact in terms of deforestation, loss of natural habitat and biodiversity. And just to give you some figures, agriculture and related use of the land activities are directly responsible for about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. If you include the aspect of land change, about 2/3, if not more, of freshwater supply is consumed in agriculture. And according to some estimates that I've read recently, about half of the loss in biodiversity is caused directly or indirectly by agriculture. So it's a massively impactful industry, but also one that has an opportunity to change and contribute positively if done responsibly, if with the right incentives, farmers transition to certain practices, whenever it's possible. And the intuition behind Varda, what prompted our sponsors, to invest in this company, was to create a collaborative environment whereby data sharing becomes a lot easier at the field level, because today it's complicated. And therefore, it becomes easier ultimately to measure the impact of the environmental impact and the climate impact of agricultural activity as scalable and as easily and as conveniently as possible. So that's the story that prompted it. It started as an initiative 3 years ago, and then early last year we spun it out as an independent entity because as being part of a multinational that is playing in the industry of selling fertilizer, we needed some degree of separation because we manage data. We want to make sure that data can be flowing from different parts of the supply chain to those who want to consume it, from those who generate it to those who want to consume it. When I talk about data, I mean what was grown in the crop, what was grown in the field, what was applied to it, how you've done the magic as a farmer of growing crops. Because unfortunately, I think, and this is my personal opinion, but agriculture is a commodity-based activity. So use commodities that have the price that is set in the global markets. But not every agricultural produce is created equal, because depending on how you do it, you may have a substantial environmental impact, but you may actually be doing conservation activity or more responsible way of doing farming. So ultimately, Varda's objective is to harness the power of data to make more visible and create a reward mechanism for those responsible farming practices, and therefore foster a virtuous cycle of productivity without going at the expense of the natural capital.
I would imagine agriculture is a data-rich environment because just the sheer volume and number of things that are going on the farm. But in terms of the capture of that data, is that my perception again would be that that's not wholly uniform. I mean, to your point, there are so many different farming practices. There are. Clearly, it's an obvious thing. It's global. It's a global phenomenon, but the sheer size and scale of is vast. Is there a sort of uniformity of data capture even that you could start to work from?
I think this is the core of what we do, if you want, because agriculture is one of the most inherently fragmented activities that humans can conduct. Because all other production, let's say mass production activities in factories or mining, have some a much higher degree of concentration, obviously, and therefore standardization and control of processes is a lot easier. Whereas agriculture is naturally distributed into hundreds of thousands of farms, if not millions of farms in the world, each of which have very different conditions depending on the soil, the terrain, the history, the kind of practices the farmers follow, the crop you sow, the climate, which is changing as we know. So to your point, I think and that's one of the reasons why Varda was created, is to create a more collaborative environment to help standardize the flow of data in a way. Although if you ask anyone in the industry about standardization of agricultural data, it's a daunting task because you have, there's different estimates, but farmers need to take dozens of decisions, if not more, over the course of a season. When am I going to plant? What variety am I going to plant? What kind of nutrition plan? What is the climate looking like? And then react also to changes along the season. If there is there a pest outbreak? Is there a fungus? Climate change is also driving new varieties and new species, new insects. For example, Italy is being plagued by the arrival of some Asian insects, for example. This is one example, right? And there's so much commerce now that is moving germs around the world, and the climate is also helping these germs to propagate into areas where they've not been present before. So all of these things require a constant change and adaptation. It's a very tough task and job because also the money to be made is limited, especially for the scale that farms typically have. So that's why we rely, especially in Europe and other parts of the rich world, on subsidies. So to get to your question, there's dozens of different variables that can affect what in the end is the data profile and the practices applied to a field. And these will not be the same year over year because there's different crop rotations. And on top of that, you have multiple tools that are used to support farmers in their activity. So farmers, whenever they use digital tools, and there's more and more of that, but also traditional tools, including Excel sheets, paper, to define, all the practices all of the key decisions that they need to take. And the real problem when it comes to try to create some standardization and some uniform language is that all of these tools do not talk to them. Most of these tools don't talk to themselves. So if a farmer uses a machine of a certain brand and a machine of another brand, the data from these two generated by these machines, whenever they have, for modern machines have a lot of really rich data, like this gigabyte per hectare, they cannot be combined. there's a lot of industry effort into the sharing of data among different competitors or parts of the supply chain, but no one is cracked enough of how to do that at scale. And that's one of the contributions, the key contribution that we want to bring, because agriculture is an inherently geospatial activity. Everything you do is based on a geographic plot or on a piece of land. So you have to have a frame of reference that is accepted by everyone. And that's exactly the service that we're creating. We're creating what we call the Global Field ID, which serves as a mechanism to at least reference data from different sources through a uniform framework of reference, of geospatial reference.
So I'd imagine even to your point around, I'm just pondering the complexity of the supply chain and the vastness of the supply chain that sits around agriculture, to again coming back to your point around how you drive any uniformity into, and therefore consequently ensure the integrity of the data that you're analysing. You're wrestling with, you don't need my endorsement, clearly you're wrestling with some really complex macro challenges as well as micro challenges.
So in fact, that's one of the things that it was a learning process when I was brought in to transform this vision into reality. The vision that the Yara leadership had was, let's create a collaborative data sharing platform. Okay, but then immediately we understood that if you want to do that, you need to create a whole taxonomy for the whole sector. Think about there's hundreds of different names for even the same crop. Sometimes it's spelled in a different way in the different systems. You have seeding decisions, you have fertilizer decisions, you have soil characteristics, you have climate aspects, as I said before, you have pesticide applications, you have machine data, what kind of fuel was consumed. It's an enormous amount of different layers of a cake. And if you want to create a coherent understanding of what is happening on the field, you need to be a master in agronomy. You need to have deep knowledge in agronomy to understand how different data sources and even taxonomies can be uniformly standardized. And we realized with the resources that we had and the time, it was impossible to do that kind of task. So we boiled it down to the problem of the geospatial identification, because then there are already many industry initiatives to try to bring together some degree of standardization for the different parts of the supply chain. For example, in the machine industry, different standards in the way the data is created. But what was missing, and that's what we realized doing some small pilots where we're trying to pull together data from 50 farms in Finland, like just a minuscule number, that there wasn't a single reference that would allow us to contextualize information that was coming from a weather station, a tractor, and a soil test. All of them have referred to the fields of the same farm with a different identification mechanism, whatever they had it, or a GPS location. So our idea was, okay, let's solve this problem, which is broad enough. It may have impact, but it's also not trying to boil the ocean. We're not trying to create a global data model for agriculture, because that requires massive involvement of too many actors at the same time. And it may never come to an end, because you have different preferences in different regions. It's a very local activity, agriculture. And so that's what prompted the idea of creating the Global Field ID. And we said, if we can disseminate an identifier, let's treat the fields as mini factories, as they are. In fact, every plot of land is a food factory, if you want, or a fiber factory. And then we assign a number to each one of them, and we create an API that allows companies that generate data, that provide services to the farmers, or that want to consume data and buy crops from the farmers, to identify the plot and the origin of the crop in the same way. Then a lot of the magic afterwards can happen. And we have at least sorted out the fundamental problem of creating a common geospatial language. And it's also something that is less invasive and threatening for anyone else, because it's some common good, if you want. Someone's creating street names in a street that is, I always use this analogy. So we don't dive into the complexity of analyzing the data. We tried to do that a couple of years ago in pilots, and we realized that it was a never-ending task, and it's bigger than we can solve. Maybe we will venture into that in the future, but at least we want to provide a transparent geospatial reference for everyone in the industry to start communicating more seamlessly without having to do one-to-one integration of all of the existing companies that provide services to farmers, because that's never going to happen. It's not economical, it's not productive.
A broad sweeping statement and generalization, never a good place to start. But the thing that strikes me, so agriculture as a space, farmers have been at the forefront of technological advancements for centuries, right? Whether that's the implication of what specific tools they might be using to make their farms more efficient. They've always struck me as it's a space that, in varying degrees, but that as early adopters of technological innovation. Is that true from your experience? Again, broad sweeping statement, but generally, is there a sense of we want this? We see the place that the data we see where it can take us.
I think it's a tough question, Leon, because I can see where your statement is coming from. But if you think about the last 50 to 100 years of technological evolution in agriculture, this has been driven by increasingly large, sophisticated corporations. From the machine standpoint, think about the machines that we used 100 years ago, which were mostly animals. Mechanization started in earnest about 100, 150 years ago in the US and then spread out. And still, many parts of the world do a lot of manual work. And there's some crops that are very difficult to mechanize. But I'm thinking about seeds. Think about genetically modified seeds or even hybrid seeds, pesticides. They require massive investment. So the previous company I was working before joining Varda was an R&D based active ingredient developer that developed new pesticides and specialty fertilizers. And the cost of developing one active ingredient with all its formulations and the regulatory approval, it's not as high as for a human medicine because you can do without the human trials, obviously. But it runs in the hundreds of millions of dollars if you want to develop a crop. So this innovation, it's just the innovation that you were referring to is now in the hands of corporations that bring into the field. I think there's obviously, it's hard to generalize because you will always find, like in any group, the early adopters, those who want to try the new technologies are always at the forefront and influence the others. But you also need to consider one thing that was told to me once, and it's very obvious if you think about it, that farmers are immediately risk averse because all of their income depends on a successful harvest. And there's so much variability in the world now because of the climate, extreme events in climate that is already causing a lot of pain, if you want, because you have losses for floods, for droughts, what have you. And so the appetite to try new stuff is, you always have to put it into the framework of risk versus gain. And therefore, typically the adoption of a new variety or of a new pesticide or a new crop nutrition product will be done in small steps. So you try a plot, and then if it goes well, you try it again in the following year, and then finally you adopt it. So it's never like a boom. And I would see that there will always be a larger group of farmers that wait to see until the others have tried it. And there's a strong, very complex web of influence that determines what our farmers will use. So if you take smallholders, obviously they're the ones who take most of the decisions. They don't have consultants that they can pay, but they will rely probably on the ones the aggregators that sell them input. More sophisticated farms, you have an army of agronomists, experts, an army, no, but several experts that they trust. Then you always have the sales representatives from the retailers or the input manufacturers. So it's a very complex web and you need to take into account also new aspects now, which are what is the environmental profile? Because until yesterday, literally, people just had to produce and quantity was the main driver. But now there is also a request from the industry, food industry in particular, to demonstrate that you're doing something to reduce your carbon footprint, to conserve nature, to not affect biodiversity, or to restore carbon in the soil, which is a big driver literally emerging in the last few years. And that's an additional element of complexity for farmers because they create trade-offs. The amount of fertilizer that you apply has an impact on that, may have an impact on your productivity. What's the optimal point? And it's a sophisticated and very complex art, which also I don't need to be very honest because I'm not on the ground. It's unfortunate.
So what was the appeal from your perspective of trying to solve what is it's an enormous undertaking? You're trying, not least when we talk about climate, but the dynamics of the problems that you're trying to solve, not only technological, social, environmental, cultural. I mean, you could almost list every tick along the way. I think this is complex. What was the inspiration or appeal from better question. What was the appeal from your perspective of trying to solve this issue?
I think for a long time now, for many years, as far as I can remember since the high school days, I've been shocked by the myopic attitude that our model of economic development has and the impact that we've had generated on nature, natural capital, and availability of natural resources. And I find it very hard to understand and believe how is it possible that there's still a debate about whether we should do something to change our models and patterns of consumption and incentivize a more responsible way of producing, consuming, whatever, being a homo economicus, if you will. So I've been passionate about sustainability ever since I was in high school. I remember probably the Kyoto Protocol year was the last year of high school. I started seeing effects on the glaciers where I used to go skiing here in northern Italy that you could notice in the space of a few years, right? Retraction of glaciers. So this is a long way to answer to your question, but to me, there's an imperative. I mean, the way I see myself in terms of work, I need to work for a company that has a purpose. And to me, the purpose of creating a more transparent relationship between what we consume and what the impact of that decisions and choices of consumption on the environment and the climate is an enormously appealing task. There was a book that I read the year before I was hired to lead Varda, which is from Yuval Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And there was one passage that really struck me where he says, prehistoric man, and actually, if you think about it, up until a few hundred years ago, most humans started to live in villages. So you were very much aware of the input of your decisions, economic decisions and consumption decisions, if you want to call them this way. You knew exactly where your food was coming from and how it was made. You knew exactly how your clothes were made and where they came from because you saw them yourself. And you knew what your pension fund was doing. It was playing in the money in front of you as your kids. Now, today, because of the complexity that we have created in the supply chains of everything around us, from microphone to a glass of water to vegetables that we eat, is so secluded from our perception and our reality that we just don't mind. And the appeal to me then to answer your question is bring in the tools to the market and to consumers to understand that when they choose a food product over another one, they actually do generate an impact. And creating that transparency in the perception to me has enormous implications, much more than because pricing mechanisms and consumption choices have much more impact than any policy or mandated cap that we know governments end up never respecting because it's the tragedy of the commons. So empowering consumers and bringing that transparency for virtuous practices, I think is a fantastic task. And I've always been passionate about sustainability, like I said. So that was a dream job coming together, and it's worth it. Was a challenge.
Yeah. Oh, and what about those challenges? What sort of challenges have you come across in terms of getting momentum with Varda? What sort of challenges have been presented to you?
I think the aside from the inherent difficulty in defining what is a field, we spent the first 6 months after Yara decided to finance us. It was an initiative within Yara, so we set it aside and decided to spin it off. The first objective, the first reason for the spin-off was to create trust, because as an incumbent, as a large multinational in the industry, I think Yara has a very strong reputation. It's been demonstrating it for many decades, but it's still a player in the industry. So it sells products, it sells fertilizers to the farmers. Treating data is a subject that is delicate because it requires trust. So the necessity to spin it out, to spin Varda as an independent entity, was driven by that factor. So I'd say the first element was the definition of what is a field. So we started working with a consortium of other multinationals talking about how do you define the field? Because it's not like, I use the analogy of a factory, but there's a crucial difference. Farmers will grow different stuff on fields depending on the season. They rotate crops. Sometimes they split them in different ways. And so you have this more or less stable entity that tends to change a little bit. So can you attribute that identity that is stable, because you don't change your name every year, right? But people need to know that it's you. So finding this equilibrium between the need for a stable identifier and a flexible mechanism of geographically and geospatially identifying it was one of the biggest challenges. And our CTO, Andy Jenkins, has done a fantastic job in building a data model with support from companies such as Syngenta and Bayer that help us in defining this problem. But if we could have gone on for years talking about this. So that was a big obstacle. The second one is creating an affordable mechanism of scaling this to the whole world. It requires having a possibility of delineating these fields and identifying them from satellites mostly, because that's the only resource of last resort that you have in an affordable way. And you finally have cracked that nut. We will announce a partnership with a Norwegian startup soon on that respect. But I think the biggest obstacle now into disseminating these identifiers into the industry is that there's always a bit of a not invented here syndrome. And at the same time, I think the fact that this can become a crucial infrastructure for the agri-food industry, and probably there is some resistance to the idea that it can be controlled by a single corporation. That's at least the impression that I have from the conversation that we have. And last, I would say, what is the use case? Because everybody agrees that there needs to be some standardization in the field identification system. Everybody agrees this is a common good. But then the next question that we typically get is, what do I gain by adopting this? And how does that translate into a return into a higher productivity for my services or a better service for the farmers that I'm trying to cater to? And I think the problem is that the key beneficiaries from the adoption of the global field ID are companies that stand at the lower end of the supply chain. It's the food companies that are under pressure from regulators and consumers to demonstrate that they're providing food that is sustainable, ultimately. Whereas the task of implementing this system and slightly changing the data models and annotating fields that are using internal digital services from other multinationals with our own system requires a bit of work. It's a minuscule amount of work, but creating a sense of priority for this is the biggest task that we're facing. So we have some ideas of what can be done with the global field ID infrastructure, in fact. But focusing on one use case is probably the best decision, but at the same time also excludes all the other possible use cases that you can do with this infrastructure. And so it automatically reduces the appeal for some parts of the market and increases it for others. Ultimately, I think that the biggest argument that we have is using global field ID as a single reference to document regenerative farming practices. And I can elaborate on what those are, but therefore reducing the risk for greenwashing, which is a big problem. If you go to any supermarket nowadays, you will see that virtually half of the products, or a good chunk of them, are saying carbon neutral or done from sustainable sources. What does that even mean? Because there's not been any regulation about that. And I think providing an infrastructure that brings that transparency, that allows those who make those claims to say, look, I'm making this claim and there's real land behind this. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what I'm sourcing. That's a fantastic outcome, in my opinion. That's worth the effort. And that's ultimately what I think can help us scale service globally.
The thing that strikes me is around, vested interest, and I mean that in a healthy way. There are so many stakeholders in the work through this process, as you rightly point out, that ultimately this whole principle around when need becomes must. So we all know, we're all very aware of the need to change. We're aware of the impact that we're having on the climate, and environmental catastrophes are becoming, it strikes me, as ever more evident. Certainly we see more and more. I mean, you mentioned flooding at the start of, when we were speaking earlier in northern Italy in, where are we? May, goodness me, end of May. We're seeing significant pattern changes around and very evident impacts on people's lives in terms of the way the climate is evolving. But you go back to, take it into the business context for the farmer, it goes right the way back to, all of this comes right the way back to bottom line in a business sense. Yes, sustainability, climate, social impact, all these are huge issues which people are wrestling with. But ultimately, there's always this sense of, but today I need to make this number. I got to survive, and that becomes the driving principle. And if I'm not making that number, the other stuff becomes. How do you overcome that? That kind of sense of you've got to combine the need for profit and sustainability and tenure of the business versus the sustainability of the planet.
That's an excellent question. I think it's the core of it. I would say this, as you correctly said, our stakeholders, the potential users and beneficiaries of what we do, span throughout the supply chain, from the input manufacturers through the distributors to farmers themselves to agronomists to grain traders, all the way down to food companies and even supermarkets. I think that the awareness, as you talked about the awareness, now that the level of urgency is increasing. And if you look about the level, I always find it striking how in the space of a few decades, we've gone from my father's generation, who doesn't give a damn about this. Yeah, they're aware of it, they're sad, but there's a sense of, what can we do when there's always more important stuff, to the new generations that are exposed to this problem since very young age and a lot more aware of it than even ours was. So that will necessarily drive consumption habit changes. When there is a consumption change, which can be accelerated and can be made worse or better depending on how policy plays. So, for example, subsidies for fuel, subsidies for electricity, plain subsidies, it depends. Subsidies for electricity that occur in some emerging markets, even if it's using fossil fuels, subsidies for food, even regardless of the crop, the production methods, they can have a negative impact. But then you have also a matter of social justice. It's a very complex subject, right? So to your question, I think the ultimate recognition of where the balance between, or the equilibrium between economic imperative, the need for making profit and preserving the climate it depends on how long a view one takes. If you project the need for resilience in food production in a few decades ahead, then changing farming practices, allowing farmers to be rewarded for regenerative farming practices, recognizing that even if it costs a little bit more for them to produce, especially in the beginning, then they deserve to be paid more and have privileged market access, especially for the segments of the population that can afford it. So decommoditizing, in fact, an industry that is very efficient based on the commodity system of prices is the fundamental driver that can shift that. Because if we continue doing as we have, there will not be, productivity will go down, land scarcity will become enormously clear. And at the end of the day, you will see that effect on prices, but except in a gradual way, you will see it in an abrupt jumps. And there's another book that really fascinated me and opened my eyes. It's called Collapse by Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel. Mm-hmm. He also wrote this book called Collapse. And he analyzes, a really fascinating book because he analyzes the rise and fall and literally the collapse of civilizations throughout very different ecological and historical periods. And one of the most fascinating chapters is the one about the Easter Island, which was colonized by the Polynesian seafarers in around 1,000 more or less, according to estimates. And it's grown up to be about 13,000 people in the island, thriving civilization, all of the Moais, the statues, and they were divided into, I think, 13 different tribes, each of which have access to a different crucial natural resource, like, beach or best cropped land or a cave for stones, etc. And what happened is that they started overexploiting their environments, which was a very finite environment. And once they started chopping down too many of the palms and trees that existed to carry around the statues and boost their art and feed their people and the population, eventually that set in motion feedback loops, which are exactly the same on a much grander scale that we're seeing in the world right now. So once you've chopped down all the trees, you no longer have birds and other mammals that can survive. So all of a sudden you lose a source of proteins. You no longer have wood to make canoes and go fishing. You no longer have firewood to cook. And that sets in motion. And the erosion of the soil becomes a lot more deeper and faster. So the productivity of even the crops that you're growing goes down. You have flooding events. That set in motion a catastrophic series of events that in the space of a few years reduced drastically the supply of food for the society. And that meant that the warrior caste seized power and they started having a civil war that ended up decimating the population. In fact, when the Europeans arrived, it was about 20% of the original population by some estimates. And what fascinated me on that story is that I think we're doing exactly the same thing on a much grander scale. And just like for the Easter Island inhabitants, they couldn't travel to anywhere else because they were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Certainly not the entire society could have migrated. And now it's the same for us. The closest inhabitant planet is probably thousands and thousands of years away of navigation at the current technology. So there's no point in looking at, you want to make any reference, but colonizing Mars, I think, is a distraction, because we need to be a lot more responsible for what we have now. The imperative is to make sure that this century we don't destroy and end up with all of the resources that we have. So I think that is the angle, that if you take that angle, and unfortunately politicians cannot take that angle because they follow a cycle of elections that is very short. It's not their fault, but there needs to be some mechanisms in creating society. And so corporations and consumers have big responsibility, and communication also, to raise the level of awareness that if we do not act now and if we do not create that feedback loop in terms of rewarding the right practices, then the impact will be much harsher and much more abrupt than we can expect otherwise. So it's worth investing in that.
It's a huge problem, isn't it? You think of this sense of societal collapse is almost incomprehensible, but yet history would evidence that it's been happening for centuries. How do you solve this stuff when, to your point around politics, is frankly the thing that strikes me around the balance of getting into politics because of a greater purpose and wanting to contribute to the greater good versus staying in politics and just wanting to get re-elected, and it becomes about power and authority and significance and all those other sorts of things. And, I think the issue around climate change is a really interesting one as to how we, in effect, the accusation that for those of us in arguably the West or in vertically developed economies, that we sit here and we've had our industrial revolution, right? You're so in some more developing nations are able to level the accusation that what you're asking us to do is stay poor in order that we can not pollute. But you did all your polluting 300 years ago. We need to do ours now so we can catch up and feed our population. That's a really simplistic, very, very simplistic way of butchering a really complex debate. But I think you're talking about it's critical stuff that these conversations take place. We have to have these conversations. Solving it takes so many people to just get on board, doesn't it? And I guess it has to start with one.
I think that there's many very interesting points that you're raising here in this, but I think number one is to solve a problem, you need to be aware that you have it. An alcoholic will never go to rehab unless they admit that they are an alcoholic first. So I think this first step is essential. We've come to great lengths with respect to that, but it's still not quite there everywhere. And unfortunately, obviously, there's always these trade-offs between environmental and economic benefit. There's an element of how do you incentivize politicians and create a mechanism of how do you create aligned incentives for politicians to do the right choices. And I don't have the solution for that, but I think that, there could be a mechanism of accountability. So there are objective KPIs. And I think that one could not stand for re-election and if some critical KPIs have not improved over a course of a couple of cycles, right? You're almost excluded. You lose the right to stand up for another election because you haven't done a good job in that. And there's obvious ways to measure, biodiversity, emissions, and all of that stuff. Then there is the more thorny topic of social justice and between the rich part and the poor part of the world, if you want to simplify enormously. And I think that it is true. It's a bit hypocritical to say you don't pollute now because we've been doing it for so many centuries. But on the other side, also helping those economies transition to more responsible ways of production and less polluting ways of production because it's in their interest first. Because unfortunately, we came first to this, but now the resources are far scarcer and the amount of population is far higher, and the consumption, and the impact, and the pressure on the natural systems is already is already unbearable. So you could say, yeah, okay, look, you've done this mess, so I can continue doing it. Yes, but if we all keep on thinking like that, then there will be some hard reckoning. And you see this with migratory waves, you see this with wars for resources. That's unfortunately the history. That book that I was referring to is a compendium of all things that can go wrong. And so the advantage that we have is that we are aware and we have the means to analyze the problem and to at least think in terms of solutions, that we need to create the incentive mechanism. And again, I go back to this transparency and accountability, because I think everybody that is placed in front of, if you buy this kind of food stuff, you have this kind of impact versus the other. So I was talking to a person yesterday who told me that the Netherlands has started implementing in some supermarkets the true price into the products that are sold. It's exactly what we have in mind. But to do that at scale, you need to create some standardization and have an origin of product that is accepted by everybody, not a proliferation of data standards, of silos, of different protocols, because otherwise consumers get lost. But I find that a choice in the right direction. And I think ultimately, if we could all do that, if we get to a system that allows you to see the true impact, the true externalities that you produce whenever you choose something, that would be fantastic. And it's a small family anecdote. My wife buys over the winter berries that come from Chile. And we always have these, I love berries. I could eat tons of them. But we always have the argument, because she's from Brazil, and so she's used to having plentiful tropical fruit and berries from the neighbor regions. But here, the transportation cost, the CO2 impact of having strawberries in January is certainly worse than buying the fruit that grows in the season. And that's an example. If you had, a disproportionate price that recognizes also the climate impact of that transportation, because the cost of transportation is very low, but you should factor in the externality, the CO2 emissions that you have into that. So carbon prices are not very popular, but I think that's the kind of at least transparency that consumers should be aware. You cannot tax it, but be aware that you impact it as well.
I read that the Varda mission is to make farm and field data the key ingredient to feed the next green revolution. In terms of what that next green revolution looks like from your perspective, how might you describe that?
It's a fantastic question. But first of all, the green revolution is a period that was referred to as after the Second World War in the 60s and 70s. Because periodically, there's been Malthusian fears that we would run out of land to feed the whole population. That happened since the time of Malthus, but there's been many predictions that this would happen. And the Green Revolution in the 60s was based on seeds and irrigation. So that's basically where countries like India massively improved their productivity. And it started becoming independent in terms of food production, despite the growth of the population that was exploded. So to me, the next green revolution is allowing the continuous increase in productivity in agriculture in a way that, contrary to the past, acknowledges the finitude of natural capital and resources, and therefore creates a positive feedback loop for farmers to adopt regenerative farming practices, which are cover crops or healthy rotation, using applying input in the right amount at the right time without over applying, treating the soil well, caring for the health of the soil in the long term, balance of biodiversity, all of the stuff. So this is what is needed. But obviously, compared to conventional practices, it requires more time, more effort. It can produce in the beginning a reduction of yield maybe, but over time, because of the health of the soil increases, you will restore the productivity, and you do it by sequestering carbon, organic matter in the soil. So this is what many startups and many companies and all of the key players in the industry are talking about this. There needs to be a mechanism to do it at scale, but most importantly, to make it visible when a farmer is doing this so that he gets a reward, either in the form of an incentive or privileged market access or some other form of support. Because nowadays, most of the time, they're kind of left alone, and there's a bit of a self-motivation. There's been a big drive in carbon farming activities in the last 4 or 5 years, which are essentially mobilizing financial capital and green capital to financial transition for farmers along regenerative agriculture. But I think carbon is one part of the equation. There is also, like I said, biodiversity, water conservation, more broadly speaking, soil health, and so all of these, let alone societal aspects, because farming employs a lot of people, many cases even minors, and in many cases the conditions are not perfect. So you also have all of these requirements. We cannot do that. We cannot, from Varda, actually help too much on that respect, but at least this level playing field in terms of geographical information and identification, I think, can be a big boost to this vision of the constantly increasing productivity whilst acknowledging the finitude of the natural capital.
So what does success look like for you?
We have a goal of having all of there's 30 to 40 global corporations between input, trading, machines that really have a disproportionate influence on the adoption of our standard global field ID. Our goal is to have at least 75% of the 40 to 50 global corporations adopting their service within the next couple of years. Another one is to demonstrate the use case that we have prioritized, which is using Field ID as a frame of reference for anyone who is claiming regenerative farming practices of some sort, therefore creating a much more transparent, sort of like a public square that reduces the incentive for cheating or greenwashing and allows consumers, and especially those who buy the crop in the first place from the farmers, to do the responsible choices. And ultimately, to me, it means accelerating drastically the amount of farmland that is under regenerative farming practices. Many companies are working in that direction. I think we can help accelerate and provide them an infrastructure that reduces the burden on something that is already complex. So ultimately becoming the standard for regenerative agriculture confirmation, claims documentation for the whole world.
And in terms of innovation, I guess what are the things that excite you? Because not least of which the work in which you're involved yourself, but I would imagine there are a number of organisations or individuals, institutions, whatever they may be, research around trying to solve a lot of these. What innovations are you really excited by in agriculture? I guess it give you that great hope for what the future could look like.
Look, this is a very complex question because there is so much innovation and I'm probably only seeing the tip of it. But for sure, there's a general drive towards much more granular traceability. So there's more data platforms that try to bring traceability to the farm level for the farmers. I think that's a fantastic partner for us. The precision farming and digitalization, they continue. So the penetration of digital tools in farms today is still in the minority, depending on the country. But I think there's more and more adoption of these tools, which will help farmers make decisions faster, better, based on algorithms that consider all of the factors and therefore optimize the input over output equation. From my previous job, I used to work in an input manufacturers. I think there's a big drive for biologicals. Mm-hmm. Biologicals have had the problem, biological active ingredients, biological pesticides, so that are based not on chemical active ingredients, but naturally occurring molecules of peptides, what have you, to help plants resist stress of any sort. There's a big movement in the industry. There's been lots of investment there, but they have sort of struggled to continue to penetrate as well as the chemical products because they have less stability. But I think innovations in that sense is certainly welcome. There's a lot of IoT and mechanization, so Internet of Things, sensors in the field. It's basically the same thing that is happening with the humans when you have all these wearables and you can monitor in real time what is happening. So that's another big drive. And all of these things, they generate data and they require a feedback loop of integrating with other parts of the supply chain. So this is another element that, in my opinion, can help us in this quest for greater transparency. And at the end of the day, I keep on repeating a bit myself in the need for greater transparency to drive awareness. And satellite technology is also making huge leaps. So the way in most of the world, wherever we have local sources of data, government-generated cadastres, we use that as the primary source for our field ID service. But in the vast majority of the world, we will rely on satellite technology. And that means that higher accuracy of the imagery at a lower cost can help you define and delineate boundaries more accurately and require less human intervention for the correction, which is one of the features that we'll have in our product. But satellite technology also helps you monitor, even at the plant level. I've seen this in some demonstrations, the growth profile, and therefore take action much more surgically in the field, only in the areas where it's necessary, which ultimately improves the input over output equation. So I wouldn't pick one. I think it's a combination. It's an ecosystem. I think the biggest innovation that we should expect and we could cheer for is consumers becoming more and more aware of the impact of their choices because they have more information, because they are aware of the fact that whatever they choose in the supermarket has a consequence. That I think is the mind shift that needs to occur, that unfortunately only a minority of people do.
I was going to say, intuitively, do you see that happening? Is there some data that would support, I think it's almost that, it's like all these things, when we become personally affected by something, then it becomes a very real issue. So when we see something on TV, news channel, whatever mechanism, streaming, whatever, we sit and we hear or read or watch something and then go, oh, that's awful. But then we get on with our lives until such time as something really impacts us personally that then affects really seismic change. And unfortunately, that would have to be sort of, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but sort of catastrophic climate events that really then start to affect individuals. We then start to think, actually, we need to be more informed around our choices. It's a shame that it should take something of that magnitude to affect the kind of change that we need here. But so do you get a sense? Do you have some hope? I guess you have a hopeful message that these are changes that are occurring?
Yeah, I obviously do have a
I'm
hope.
an eternal optimist. I may not be the best person to ask.
Glad to know. A bit less, but if I didn't have any hope for this, I should probably not do what I do, to be honest. Because it would be pointless. But human beings are creatures of habits, and especially, commercial advertisement and the brand effect has an enormous sticking effect on our choices, right? You can see the best story from an alternative brand, but you never heard it. You want to stick to the one that you know. So I think it's the responsibility of the consumer goods companies, who are very well aware of this issue. All of the major brands are investing a significant amount of resources to help the transition. The problem that I see is that there needs to be some clear framework of reference to avoid that we do a race of claims against reality, which is not necessarily reflected in the way things are really happening on the field. But to your question, I think it's a very lengthy process. There's also a bit of sadly getting used to bad news, if you know. There's a bit of a fatigue to the tragic.
Yeah, you make a good point. Yeah,
that's a risk, and until it affects you directly, it's going to be hard. But prices again are going to have a massive effect. And last year, for example, I saw we had a drought in Italy. And because of the war in Ukraine, the price of grains and silage and feed for animals was so high that I read that some animal farms had to reduce the number of pets that they had. So to me, this is a demonstration that meat is a big problem, right? Especially bovine meat. That's one of the main reasons for deforestation, especially in the Amazon, because it's cheaper to clear new land and then produce meat that is cheaply sold. Breaking this mechanism of creating the relationship between the choice. Again, sorry, I'm repeating myself, but to me, it was linking the fact that Italy was the largest importer of beef from Brazil with the fires that were raging in the Amazon 3-4 years ago, and every year for that matter, but were particularly bad in 2019, was the clicking moment that prompted me to drastically reduce the amount of meat that I consume. And I know this is a delicate subject because there's many people who love meat, and I think I'm not a Taliban that says that people should stop eating meat, but just the true price, right? If you incorporate the externality factor, you couldn't buy cheap meat, and you should, instead of eating it every day, you should have it maybe once a week or twice a week, as ancestors used to do very regularly. So that's perfectly fine. But I think the change requires a long process, and we hope to contribute to that by creating this level of transparency and creating mechanisms for that feedback loop between consumption and production choices that the market solely needs.
I think to your point around transparency, people are then making informed decisions.
Yes.
Aren't they? Enabling consumers to make informed decisions, or farmers to all of us to make informed decisions. I think it's fascinating as to, we have this constant thirst for consumption, technological innovation. Now, as you're talking, I'm thinking about something, and I'm going to butcher this now, but I'd read, and because I can't quite remember the specifics, I'm conscious of actually doing it a really poor representation of what I read. But that, if we look at, for example, electric cars, we all think, well, electric cars, that's a great idea, right? So we have to move away from our dependence on oil-based products, and so we move to electric vehicles. But no one's talking about the issue of lithium, not enough people are talking about the issue of lithium batteries, right? So, and the environmental implications of lithium batteries. And I'd also read that now there are expeditions, I'm not sure that's the right word, but parties going into parts of the Amazon basin, for example, to look at sources of lithium and other minerals and materials that we need for power power generation to power vehicles, whatever. So we're now so batteries. So we're going to dig holes. We're going to dig holes in the ground for batteries now because we want to move away from oil. So we're going to stop digging for oil and dig for battery materials that make batteries. So there's the kind of cause and effect. There's every step we make. There's a trying to balance that out with the negative impacts. It's never an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's a bit like in the winter when you have a blanket that is not big enough and you put it on one side and your feet are cold and then your head is full, and then it's a bit like that. And unfortunately, it feels like a little whack-a-mole when it comes to this, because there's a very large population with very well ingrained consumption patterns that go beyond the natural regeneration. But I think on the cars is another aspect, since you're at it, and it's how we generate that electricity in the first place. Because renewables are not the full, don't provide all of that capacity, especially if you electrify a sector that was running on petrol. Then if you're burning coal to power those cars, it's a bit meaningless, right? So I think sometimes it's easy to find a quick fix because we want simplification, but the complex nature of our supply chains and our production system and our economy leads to those feedback loops. And in fact, one of the most amazing places that I've seen in my life is the desert of Uyuni in Bolivia, which is it's the largest salt desert in the world. It's about 12,000 square kilometers. It's a never-ending expanse of salt, very hard salt hexagons that ranges until you can't see the end of it when you're in the middle of it driving. And that's actually when I read that there's one of the largest deposits of lithium in the world. And I was appalled to see that, there's going to be massive mining operations in probably one of the three most beautiful places in South America that I've seen. And again, to your point, the Amazon is going to be less visible because it's in the middle of nowhere, but that place is a very popular tourist destination, and both of them deserve protection. But hey, do we want jobs or trees? That's the usual equation, and then it's easy to dismiss this as one or the other. I think you should want both, and I think there's means to get to both eventually.
So when we're fortunate that we have smart people like you wrestling with these hugely complex challenges, but when you're not wrestling with solving issues such as this, how do you relax? Let's get away from the workplace for a bit. How do you relax? Do you relax? And I imagine these are issues that don't switch off, right?
Yeah, no, very much. I very much do. And thanks for the question. I love it. There's probably three things. One is the first is music. I was lucky enough. My parents, when I was 4 years old, they started putting me into piano lessons. Since then, I've been playing the last few years far less, but sometimes I go there to the keyboard. I've been picking up another instrument. It's the handpan. I don't know if you've seen it. Those melodic drums that are amazing. It's super relaxing. And I love listening to music. Probably once or twice a year just to vent off that energy with very good electronic music. But in general, otherwise listening to music. I do some sports. I love skiing, actually, snowboarding. I was blessed. My parents had an apartment in the Alps, in a place where the ski resort near the border with France and Switzerland. So every winter, that's where most of my best friends go. We maintain these friendships for 40 years almost, because we meet in this place in the mountains, and so walking there in the summer or skiing is fantastic. And then I love reading. I really love reading. My wife complains because there's once a week there's a new package that arrives at home with a book, and so we made a deal that every time I buy a book, because my pipeline is growing, and I'm not fast enough at reading them, so she decided to buy a plant every time I buy a book, and I think it's a fantastic deal because we help sequester CO2. You see.
But I think it's to your point around growing up in northern Italy and seeing the impact, growing up and spending time in the Alps, you'd have seen in very real time the impact that climate change was having on the mountainside. I mean, I was struck by. I remember I was fortunate to go to spend some time in France, in Chamonix, in September.
Right on the opposite side of where I go.
It's a beautiful. I'd never been outside of a ski season, and it was really interesting. I was doing a lot of walking, really interesting, speaking to some of the guides that I was walking with there as to, they were picking out specific glaciers and saying, well, hey, look, it used to be this size, it's now this size, and looking at the impact that climate change is having on livelihoods as well. So how people are having to, they now, I think I'm right in saying, have more visitors in that part of in Chamonix now, mountain bikers and hikers and walkers in those summer months than they do for those ski seasons, but actually economically as well as environmentally. So I guess all of these things would have been, affected in those very formative years when you're spending time on, skiing, snowboarding, enjoying time with pals. They really start to form some of these opinions and issues that we start to tackle through our through our adult lives.
See, I was thinking about what were the, whether there was a moment in my life where I really realized that the whole sustainability topic was going to be something that I was passionate about. And I think one of those moments was exactly, so we go to ski typically on the opposite side of the Mont Blanc, so on the Italian side, which is called Courmayeur. And that's facing south. So the effect that we see on the glaciers on the Italian side is even bigger. And I remember, I think it was the winter of 1999 was the first time in the winter that there wasn't any snow. So there's typically one slope that takes you back to the parking lot in the park at the end of the day. And that was the first year where we couldn't ski back to the parking lot. It was 1999. It was an exceptionally dry winter, but in the last 4 years, guess what? All of them have been exceptionally dry winters. You see the glacier line receding. And those are the environments where you're unfortunate or fortunate enough to have that perception of the urgency and the need for action and awareness again of the problem that people that live in a city probably do not have. And it prompts you to at least not dismiss the thought because you're in front of it. And typically these are geological phenomena. There's a group of people that say, these are naturally occurring phenomena. It might be, okay, climate has changed over the course of billions of years of the Earth a lot. I think the speed is obviously now, it's obvious to everyone now that it's affected by our existence and our consumptions. And so that having that postcard in front of you with a receding line of ice every year is certainly a motivation factor.
So what drives you, Davide?
So in general, I think from a work perspective, I'm lucky because I consider I wake up and I do something that it drives me in the sense that I contribute to a better world. And that's also been incredibly powerful as a message to attract brilliant people in our organization. But personally, this is something that sounds a bit superficial, but it's the relationship with people. I really get excited. And one of the things that I suffer the most about the pandemic is that you only have this mediated video calls, which do not allow you to establish a relationship. So I'm really curious about knowing people, understanding and learning their stories. I form relationships generally quite easily. And that's something that I don't know if it's a drive if you want, but certainly it's an element of satisfaction in life. And other than that, I'd say solving the problem of sustainability, the contributing to making the world more sustainable, I think is from a professional standpoint, peaking what we said earlier, is a strong driver element.
You mentioned that point around people. Who have, from your perspective, who have been the biggest influences on you? Not only perhaps maybe from a career perspective, but from a personal point of view. Who are the people you've found to be really influential through your life?
It's a very good question. I'd probably give answers about regular people that I know because it's easy to be inspired by these great figures, but that's you never get to form a relationship with them. So
no, I think you make a really good point. I think there's almost a broad sweeping statement again, but there's almost a sort of there's a checklist of the people when you say, and that's why I slightly changed my question around who do you admire. But I think influence is an interesting one because there's almost as I say, there's this sort of checklist, and we go down it and we go, well, it's so we go either to those from a business perspective, is it Musk or Bezos or Gates, or, so we go to people that have generated enormous personal wealth, Buffett, or we go down the sort of sports star route. So there's this sort of natural, because people, but I actually think that those figures around us that really are hugely influential, so often unsung,
yes,
but that are so influential on our lives are the ones that really do affect us.
Look, this is a beautiful question. So I want to take some time to reflect, and I'll give the first names that come to my mind. And I probably contradict myself and bring a couple of more famous names later, but certainly I've been influenced certainly by my parents in terms of the values, the honesty, certain aspects of how you lead your life. Not necessarily in all things positive. Also, other aspects of my character that I changed over the course of my maturation. But it's inevitable, and I was lucky enough to have parents that really gave me a lot of opportunities. There's a recent, I think, more than people's stories of people. One of our very good friends here in Milan was falsely accused of being in the mafia 3 years ago. He had done a transaction with a company that ended up being the front from the mafia family from Sicily, and we know the guy. I mean, his wife is the best friend of my wife, and he was a super honest person. It's obvious that was a judicial mistake. And this guy was wrongly not incarcerated. He was kept at home arrest for 2 months and lost his job. And it was a terrible story. He had just had a young baby. And the way this guy reacted, so ultimately he was proven not guilty, obviously. But I was amazed by how he rebounded from a situation that would have killed probably a lot of people, because you get into a loop of desperation and how am I going to make it out of here? And he's over the course of the next few months, he's started a new online business and managed to get to a much better situation economically and personally than he was before, and came out of this terrible adventure in a way that is a very inspiring story, in my opinion. His name is Daniele, and he ended up on the newspapers because he participated in a TV show years before. So obviously his picture was the first page. The press loves to prey on this kind of easy targets, but he was proven non guilty, and I think it was a fantastic story of resilience. And positive thinking leads you to, being able to overcome even the most dire circumstances. Along those lines, there's a person that I met last year. Her name is Michelle Barocchi, who had a terrible accident 6-7 years ago, and her leg got amputated. And she told about how she survived this whole terrible adventure. She lost 5 liters of blood by breathing and practicing, Ujjayi breath from yoga, and ultimately managed to not only recover from the injury, but now she actually started to dedicate her life to bringing the power of ancestral medicine and alternative plant medicine to heal humans with any sort of problem that might have, not only physical ailments, but also mostly psychological ailments. And it's a very inspiring story, I think. If you want the celebrities, I would say along similar lines, Alessandro Zanardi. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was a pilot, an Italian pilot that lost both his legs in one of the Indy races. And after he got 2 legs amputated, he started a career as a ultra marathon and Ironman runner on a wheelchair, beating records, doing much faster than people with legs. Actually, this is a guy that was amazing because, in Italy he's very popular because he's been the quintessential story of self-resilience. Sadly, 2 years ago, he had another accident while driving the bike. So he's been hit by a truck. So I know he's recovering now. There's not been a lot of news that he's doing a bit better, but it was a very bad accident. But this is like the warrior. If you think about a guy that thinks he can overcome any kind of problem, I think it was a very inspiring tale, and everybody in Italy and elsewhere in the world is familiar with the story is very much inspired.
I think it's stories such as that. Actually, one of the things I mentioned earlier, that a bit of a throw remark about being an eternal optimist, but it's one of the things that the kind of human spirit, the human endeavor, I'm a great believer that the human will prevail. And actually coming back to the objective and mission and purpose for Varda, that you turn that into the big sense of what's going on from the environment, from a climate change, and what's going on to on the planet right now, what's happening to the planet, my sense is, there's human beings we're an incredible race, right? And I think, we're incredibly resilient. We can overcome enormous complexity of challenge. The combined kind of willpower and brain power of the 7 billion of us that there are now on this great planet, I think gives me huge hope for what can be achieved. And even in looking at these stories, you hear these things, you think it's incredible. Actually, you then compound that and think, what could we achieve if we, with the right will, the right willpower, the right brain power? It excites me for the future.
100% agreed. And there's actually one person that I didn't mention that I should have been the first one in the list. Now that you mentioned, this optimistic shift on mindset. The most influential person in my life has been my wife. When I met her, I was much more angry, was prone to overreacting to a lot of things and being pessimistic in general about many aspects of life. And she's exactly the opposite. That's the reason why I married her, because it's the perfect combination. But being exposed on a daily basis to this, singing and smiling face you don't see this because you're immersed in it every day. But I'm sure that it has a massive impact in terms of my perception of what you just said, seeing the future in a positive way, thinking that you can affect change, believing in yourself, and being nice to people, which is also very important. And we can tend to forget because we're all in this together. And this ego separateness illusion is one of the biggest problems of our society and the human brain. But I think as soon as we realize that we're in the same boat, not only metaphorically, but in reality, we're all connected. We influence each other with the energy, the thoughts, and the deeds, and the words that we say. That's enormously, enormously powerful concept to keep in mind. And she's been a great teacher with that respect.
If you reflect back, what advice might you give your 21-year-old self?
I think it would be hard to give only one advice, but I would spend more time socializing with unknown people. Because I said I love people and I actually love socializing, but here in Milan, I had my circle of friends. And until I started traveling in university, even after that, until I started working abroad, I've always stuck to the same group of people, which are still very good friends of mine. But I've been, being exposed to the diversity of backgrounds, having less prejudice, because there was a bit of a prejudice, in my opinion, here because of our environment. Listening and being more open to give a chance to unknown people to teach you, even when on paper they're very different from you. I think would have served me better. But I've also enjoyed doing the mistakes that I've done, because you only grow through those. And I probably 3 years ago I wouldn't have said that, but I reckon that that's exactly how you grow in life. Otherwise, if everything is easy and if you've done all the right choices, I think it would be much less meaningful.
So what does the future look like for you?
The future looks like we're going to launch, we've actually been launching Varda. So I speak from a professional standpoint. We're launching Varda in the key geographies, Brazil, North America, Western Europe, and then slowly, gradually expanding the rest of the world and the global field ID service through the rest of the year. And to me, this is a year where we really want the market and the world to know about our existence and to embrace the service, and finding partners to scale the service and bring it to make it a standard. That's the number one objective that we're set on. Personally, getting more healthy on the physical side, changing nutrition. That recently started that, and keep on enjoying life, going to music festivals and stuff like that. So in the immediate future, that's what I intend to do.
Fantastic. And where you mentioned the Varda, coming back to that, where can people go to find out more?
Sure. So we have a website, that www.varda.ag. There you can find the key features of our product. Also, all of the team members are represented there. We have a couple of videos on YouTube that explain what the Global Field ID does. It's easy. Just find Global Field ID on YouTube. We will start publishing more on our social media channels as we progress. LinkedIn obviously is a good source for those who in the business community. But I hope that also through this podcast, people will know more about us.
Fantastic. Davide, it's been great to speak with you this morning. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for taking the time out. And I think it's there are many privileges. One of the many things I love about the experiences I enjoy through the podcast, not least of which I can't fail but to learn from the experiences of those with whom I engage. And I've certainly learned a lot this morning. And I think we're lucky that there are people out like you out there wrapping their heads around these really complex challenges that ultimately affect us all. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to come and share some of that experience that you've enjoyed with us today.
Likewise. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been great.
Thank you, Davide. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.